Rambam Bikkurim Perek Vov. A person who purchases bread from a baker, chayav b'chala, is obligated to separate challah. He may separate a portion from bread freshly taken from the oven for bread that has cooled, or from bread that has cooled from bread freshly taken from the oven, even with regard to many trays of bread. Vav, base. The obligation to separate challah applies to dough from 5 species of grain: wheat, barley, rye, oats, and spelt. As the Torah says, when you partake of the bread of the land. Bread is referred to only a loaf from these 5 species. If a person makes bread out of rice, millet, or other legumes, he's not obligated of challah at all. Now, even though there's no obligation to separate truma from leftover shichel, pay a grain which is hefter, and grain which did not reach a third of its growth, there's an obligation to separate challah from these. There's an obligation to separate challah from dough made from grain, from meiser were separated from the grain, while still stocks or trumas meiser were separated from it, even though the portion of the grain truma is still included. Grain that was from the second meiser sheni or hektish that was redeemed, the extra portion of barley harvested for the Emer offering, the 2 loaves separated to be offered the Shavuos, which were redeemed. When a dough was made from a grain from the second Ma'aser Sheni Yerushalayim, or from grain of Shvis, or Safek Meduma, Tzchai B'chala, Meduma, Pat Menachala, a mixture of Truma, and only exempt from the obligation of Chala. Hey, challah is taken to keep the nazir asal nasrei p'turim nacheren chalam neishein kedesh. The loaves of the Thanksgiving offering and the wafers of the nazir are pater challah. The machrim meshuk nazir makriv teidachem b'challah. If they were made to sell in the marketplace to nazirim or to carbon teid, they are chay b'challah. The fisher b'daitishim leitim machir yeflano. Since the baker had the kavana that if they're not sold, he will eat them. There's an obligation to separate challah from a dough made for partners, even though that many people made. A person makes a dough using grain that is tevel. Also, whether the challah separated before truma or the truma separated before challah, what he did is what he did. If he separated challah, he should not partake of it until he separates truma and trumas meiser. If he separates truma first, he should not partake of it until he separates challah. When a person makes dough with the kavanah of feeding the bread baked from it to a domesticated animal or wild animal, he's pater from challah. When it comes to food that you give to the dogs, if the shepherds eat it, you have to take off challah. A dough made by a guy is exempt from challah. How you saw about if a goy and a yid were partners in dough, if the yid had ownership that was large enough to be chayav for challah, then as a chayav for challah, it's obligated for challah. When a goy separates challah, even Eretz Yisrael, it's not challah. Rather, we inform him and we tell him that he's not obligated to. The dough separated may be eaten by a zar. Why don't we suspect that maybe the dough belonged to a yid and he gave it to a goy, so in order to exempt him? Because if a yid wanted to exempt himself, he could do so by making a dough smaller than the required measure. When a person mixes flour from wheat and rice flour and makes a dough, if he has flour of grain, challah must be separated from it. Even if one placed yeast from wheat into dough from rice, one is obligated if there has flavor of wheat. It's chayiv, and if not, it is ptura. Yud bis iser shini shelish shini loisha biyayne shemani tvashe mayim reitchim oishan nasalatich teichay tablet tiachamayim yishtach hakemach teichay v'losho. Now, there's a chiyuv to separate challah as following: a dough that was kneaded with wine, oil, or honey, or boiling water, or one of which spices were placed. Water was boiled, flour was placed aside of it, and dough was kneaded. So the halacha is a mafon. If it was baked in ben betana ben mekaka ben ala machlas from marcheshes, whether it was whether in an oven or a pit in the earth, whether in a frying pan or a deep pan, beishi as abatzet b'machavas of marcheshes vakach irtichem beish v'mato achnefas apas. Whether one first attached the dough to the frying pan or the deep pan and then heated it by them with a fire below the loaf until the loaf was baked, or one heated it then first and then attached the dough. When setiach vakach heated the kabatzet, the halacha is kolelu are all chayim b'chala. Habayis isa liyapshu b'cham b'bad elivashva v'gderet v'pturim and achala shein ma'is cham lechem ben shloshtem b'mayim and shloshtem b'shar mashlim. If our one made a dough to try it in the sun alone or cook in a pot, is patr chala. For dough cooked in the sun is not bread, whether it was kneaded with water or any liquids. Pater, moves to grain that was kneaded whether with water or honey, or which is eaten without being baked, is pater. Because the obligation of challah applies only to dough that was ultimately baked as bread for human consumption. When dough was needed to make a dough to be cooked in the sun, and then the person completed making the loaf of bread, or he began making it into bread and completed it to cook in the sun. Roasted flour was needed to bake a loaf of bread. Well, then it's all obligated in challah. When bread was made to be used for kutach, the manner in which it is made indicates that intent. If you made as cakes, it's an obligation of challah. If you made it in stripes, it is patul challah. What is the minimum measure of dough which we are obligated to separate challah? An entire imer of flour, whether one of the 5 species or from all 5 together, for they are combined to reach the minimum measure. What is the measure of a imer? 1/5 of a kav, less than 2 kavim. A kav avalugin, a kav is for lugin, malugin is avar revis, revis at spayim, barum at spayim, achatz at spayim, chemish at spa. Revis is the volume of a cube, 2 finger breadths by 2 finger breadths by a height of 2 7/10 of finger breadths. The finger breadth refers to so that's an aimer is a measure of 10 finger breadths by 10 finger breadths by a height of approximately 3 1/9 finger breadth. Now, Benis for chemisch bits by mishkol mashisha shwaim slime shnei slime sela mekemach achit shvuntzayim shemishkol chemisch sri meis vesem zuzim misayim zman hazeh midish v'chiluk mishkol zeh kemikemach achitim hazeh bo mid machal b'chol makom. So the Rambam asks, how much does the measure contain? So the volume of 43 1/5 eggs. This is equivalent to the weight of 86 2/3 slime of an Egypt wheat flour, which is equivalent to 520 zuz of Egyptian zuzim at present. A measure that comprises weight is used universally to measure for the separation of challah. It's forbidden for a person to make his dough less than the minimum measure in order to free himself from the obligation of challah. When a person separates challah from a dough that is smaller than the prescribed measure, his actions are of no significance or consequences, and the dough is ordinary dough as before. Also, Asal shir challah, asal mustaf l'challah, mafir challah manat pas. When a person made a dough that's less than the prescribed measure, baked it, put it in a basket, then baked again. So all these collectively become chayv and chalani, and you have to be mafresh. Remember, it teaches us that one should separate challah from bread that is baked. The challah oven, however, does not join loaves together to create an obligation to separate challah. Design. If a loaf were joined together and a quantity of equal to the measure of challah was gathered together as an obligation to separate challah, this applies even if they are not placed in the basket together. If one bake loaves a little bit at a time and gather together the entire quantity of bread does not have it's a suffix of chalash of the rim. Im chalash of the rim, he in a chiv v'abshav shenitzaref v'isi klishish b'teich. If the obligation to separate challah is midrabanan, one is not obligated to separate until they are gathered in a container with a cavity. When the flour was not sifted, but instead needed together with its bran, since the entire measure of flour comprises of there's an obligation to separate challah. If, however, one removed the bran from the flour and then completed the measure of dough by returning the bran to the flour, there is no obligation to separate challah. When a baker makes a dough to become yeast and divide it, there's an obligation to separate challah. If not sold, he will use it as bread. If, however, one makes a dough to divide all of the dough, is when a woman gave flour to a baker to make yeast, if none of them individually gave enough flour to make a dough that comprises the required measurement, even though the dough made from the flour which they all gave does, they are potter. Hilchos Bikkurim Perek Zayin Aleph Shtei Yisis Shish B'Shtein Shir HaChayev B'Chala Me'im B'Achas Ben Kashir V'Naglu Zu B'Zu V'Nesh Gazu Azay Ma'ir Shal Shnayim Afilei Min Echa P'Tur Min HaChala. When there are two doughs, that when combined comprise the measure that obligates the separation of challah, but neither comprises the measure alone, should they touch each other and become attached to each other. So if they belong to two individuals, they are pater from challah, even though they are the same type of grain. We say the two people are makpid. It is known that they would not object to the combination of the doughs. They are considered as one. Base. If the two belong to one person, if it's one grain, so then it's combined and it's chayav b'chala. But if it's two, they're not mistarf. One is not machbid. He objects to the combination that one dough not touch the other or become mixed. They're not considered as one and a non-mitzdarf. What does it mean mitzdarf? When the dough from one wheat touches a dough from spelt, so they're combined. Another type of shifan. So, if it touched the dough from another type of grain, let's say barley touches a dough, or spelt oats or rye, or spelt oats or rye touch each other, halachas are ilim starfin. They are combined. Starfus. Now, isus chodesh and starfus of shel yashan af b'shem mirechad. Dough from grain from 1 year should not be combined with the dough from a previous year. Lest people say that the truma will be separated from new grain for an old. Medra Amorim is Beisr Shanag Beisacher Saval Bel Kemach Hameshes Amil Beisa Men Isa Achas Hamesham Starv Lashir Isa Chalak Mesham Beyond. Now, when one dough touches, when does this apply when one dough touches each other? If, however, one mixes flour from the species of grain and makes a single dough from one of them, flour are combined to comprise the measure of dough required for challah, as we explained. Hey, Isa Shi B'chusim Kashir Mikan, Isa B'chusim Kashir Mikan, Isa Shena Chavas B'chalas B'amsa Gan, Isa Eres, Isa Struma, Meduma, Isa Sakum, Half Mishanegas Ubazin with Stavar Shai Davarpat, Nachal Mal B'amsa. If you have, let's say, two things which are lower than this share, then you have something which combines them, but that combination is putter, so they are putter even though it's in middle. When by contrast there is dough from which challah was separated between them, the outer doughs can be combined because originally there was an obligation to separate challah from the dough in the center. The dough that was consecrated was in the center, they're combined because the dough was fit to be redeemed. There was a dough, another type of grain, and dough belonging to another person, or a dough from a different year. Between them, the doughs of the side are combined. There were two doughs, each of them less than the minimum measure of challah. One separate challah from each of them. Afterwards, they touched each other, and the combined doughs comprised the required challah. There's an obligation to separate challah. The challah separated originally mean nothing. It says, two goyim made a dough comprising the required measure, and they divided it, and then they became gainim. And then each one added the required amount in their thing. The law is as far as there was no time that it was the size of obligating challah while they were going, because each was to receive less than the required measurement. However, Yidden made a dough in the above manner and then divided each of them as the portion they are potter. Because they already had a time that they were obligated. And it was exempt at that time because the dough was made to be divided. The dough was owned by a goy and a yid in partnership, and they divided it. And then Rachel Laskai or Akko, and then the goy became a yid. Now the ger added to his vishal, so the Yashis can collect the such the shirt is shal. So Lachus Chanel is for shal Akko Ptura. The yid is higher, the goy is putter. Yid Alf and Etel Serm Yisr Shlerum Bachalas and the Solotin Yisr Shom Bachalazar as a Mimi Yisr Shnia Shiba Im Seir Zer Shir Yisr Shachabas Bachala and Isim Tefa Yisr Shom Bachalasa or Mafresh when Yisr Shnia Shir Chala Lal Sir the Shitam and Amuka Vein like Yisr Shnia Nasas Kula Teva Mamresh Chala Alakol Shatava Mini Yisr Bakosho. A person takes a yeast from a dough from which challah was not separated and places it in a dough which challah was separated. He should bring a second dough together with this yeast will comprise a measure that obligates the separation of challah, combined with the dough from the challah was separated. He should then separate from the second dough the appropriate measure of challah for it. In this manner, he's separating challah from the dough in the same place. If he does not have the second dough, the entire for his dough is considered as tevel. He should separate challah for the entire amount. As far as that, when tevel is mixed with this type, even the slightest amount causes the mixture to become forbidden. In base, he saw full challah in a challah. A dough that was full challah has not been separated. It's like challah. It's not challah, but even not tumah. It's like cholam in regards to tumah. Shena sheni is shlishi, b'cholam the sheni doesn't make it shlishi. Like cholam, like we explain okay, like we're going to explain in its proper place. Permitted to cause cholam to contract ritual impurity in Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, when there are two doughs, one which is Torah, one is Teira, Natal Tmeyan Teira, Natal B'di Chalash Dem Yisr Shleihor Machalas when Nissen meant to Samal Yisra Teira, and Rachel Manat Tmeya Teira the Beitza to Nitem Namokif. So what you should do is, if there are two doughs, one which is Tamei and Tar, one may take a portion of dough equivalent to the measure of challah to be separated from both of them, from a dough from the which challah was not separated, and place it in the center close to the pure dough. You should then extend a portion of the impure dough the size of an egg to the pure dough, so will not be able to separate challah from the dough in the same place. Person may make a pure dough and refrain from separating challah from it, setting it, or a portion from it aside from continuously separate challah from the other doughs until the dough set aside becomes a challah that's entirely afil. In the what Isa after this, challah down the kain. Supplies even if the doughs become impure. When it becomes like not fit for human consumption, it's in the mapshala. When there is a question whether or not challah has been separated from the doughs on which he's separating challah, as far as the challah of suffix may be taken from pure dough, the impure, the initial preference, and then two need not be in the same place. Bikkurim Perek, and the person separates challah from flour, it's not challah, and the flour given the kohen is like stolen property. The rest of the Isa is chayav and challah. V'isa kemach shipir t'shem challah imish ba'in b'raso Isa is a mafresh min challah k'shar kol kemach selis. If the flour set aside mistakenly as challah is an aimer measure, and a dough was made from it, one must separate challah from it as necessary with regards to dough made from ordinary flour. When should challah be set aside? When one adds water and mixes the flour with the water, you should set aside a portion from challah, as it says, in the first of your dough. Supplies provided a measure of flour equal to the aimer that has not become mixed with the water, does not remain in the kneading dough. The if he makes a tanai, this is challah for the dough from the yeast, and for the flour that remains, when it all becomes one dough, the portion set aside will become sanctified as challah is permitted. Person left the dough intact until it was all kneaded and mixed together and separated the challah afterwards, means it's nothing. If he does not separate challah while the mixture is dough, bakes the entire dough, he should separate challah from the loaf, as we explained. When does the obligation of challah take effect? When the wheat flour was rolled into a ball and all the flour becomes mixed. Or when the barley flour is made into a single mass and formed one block. The person could snack from the dough until the wheat flour is rolled into the ball. The barley flour was made into a single mass. The laws pertain to wheat flour pertain to spelt flour, and those pertain to barley flour pertain to oat and rye flour. Hey, once the full wheat flour was rolled into a ball, or the barley flour was made into a single mass, one who partakes of it before the challah separated is chayiv misa. Therefore, if the Torah obligates to separate challah from the dough, a person who partakes of it is chayiv malchus. Anyone who partakes of tevel, the meisach has been doing the halachas maganis malchus malchus. The damda actually is gadol tura. When a dough from ordinary flour became mixed with flour that was truma, before all the flour was rolled into a ball, it's potlet. And it's gadol, but once it's rolled, chayav. If in a mafter, she says a mafter is a kiddush gadol dough. First was mafter to isa or mafter before it became rolled, and then redeemed it. Izafah by vachad the disha tinker isi. If the if he consecrated it before he rolled it, and it was rolled in the possession of the temple treasury, and afterwards you redeemed it as potter, for at the time the obligation would have taken effect, the dough was exempt. If a guy gave flour to Yid to make his dough from it, and then he gave him the dough as present, if he gave it to him as present before it was rolled into a ball, he's chayiv. If he gave it to him afterwards rolled in, he's potter. And a comer joins the Jewish faith, and as he sent his goggle out, so the Allah is actually in his gayer is put out. Imish in his gayer is chayav. Is a subject chayav is b'chalav the fee shu of a misa. If it's a subject, it's chayav because it's of a misa. Reserve shal b'chalav subject gets the Allah is ein chayav nala is chayav. Yet Isa should not be subject to makan get his goggle is a betumah if you shmut the time bechon mer to solve it to serve chalasa. When a question arises concerning the purity of dough before it was rolled together as a ball, he should prepare the dough in a state of ritual impurity. For it's permitted to take a chulin, a tummy in there to soul, and it should be burnt. Nil lo achar is God will suffer too much. Shabbat and time is a chulin matir. Gmirno betaro. Shabbat and time is a chulin goes all svegi bechulin chulin mechalish leitamo is in oil and it will. L'chala v'tia chala tliya l'nefas l'service. They also have the mitzvah betum l'chatchila l'izar v'shtal yitur who the kill the lapish chala teira. A person should not prepare his dough in a state of tuma. Instead, he should be careful and make sure to purify himself and his kalim so that he can separate challah in a state of tahara. If there's more than a shtu b'tumah, the average challah to man, he should separate challah b'deya. In isin challah ma'amars b'tara, a person should not make challah amars b'tara. But isin is chulam b'tara. Ketzat haso megabel isa se'achavar ma'avish menakdi challah samnichem menikol mekli avon ukli adam Hashem mekam b'tumah kshavim ma'amars netel. Eshtem le'sil v'sachala v'em le'izur shleitiga v'chala shem tak to the tazar t'tivum ne'imai tidu zam mishuk t'chayav t'gabo. Ages cover menakdi z'bedeles menaiches am yisoavam shedapel mayim yisoletesel yisam b'nishi yisis b'tumah. Geen aftem she's a betum leilasham layer from in Masini de David or Melis Nessa Pastor Bowler. At the camp after my mother's Bestoria of Omerly flash to Holly Fair Ladders to Shira Halam Suffolk, where a person purchases bread from a baker who is this common person in Syria, and the baker tells him, I separate challah. The purchaser does not need to separate challah because of doubt. Shave from Nefta for the show about it. I'll throw the Kafla next to Bestoria challah. The camp of loads the arts from Nanafter Lavish Halam Suffolk, and a person purchases bread from a baker in Chutz la'aretz, he has to separate challah because of the suffix of the kem. While abayis, which are limit, I'm sorry if I've played, then the office any Israel average challah suffix.